The smoke still hung in the air when Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Casey understood the impossible mathematics staring back at him. December 7th, 1941. 6 hours since the last Japanese bomb fell on Pearl Harbor, and Casey stood motionless in his Honolulu office, watching ash drift past his window like snow that would never stop falling. His desk held a map that stretched 6,000 miles across an ocean dotted with red pins. Each one marked a place where America would need to land planes if it wanted to fight back. Wake Island, Midway, Guadalcanal, dozens of coral atolls and jungle clearings that existed only as coordinates on a chart. Casey pulled out his slide rule. The calculations took minutes. The answer took his breath away. 40,000 tons of concrete per runway. 300 skilled workers. 45 days minimum if the weather held and nobody shot at you while you worked. He ran the numbers again, hoping he'd made a mistake. At America's current construction capacity, the Corps of Engineers could build maybe 12 airfields in a year. The Pacific Theater needed over 60 just to have a fighting chance. His aide entered carrying intelligence reports that made the math even worse. Navy wants operational airstrips at 37 forward positions within 18 months. Major Robert Stevens said, setting down the folder like it weighed more than paper should. How many can we actually build? Casey's pencil tapped against the map, counting pins that would never become runways. 18. Maybe 20 if we're incredibly lucky and the Japanese let us work in peace. The silence that followed carried the weight of a war already lost before it truly began. By February of '42, Casey's nightmare had become doctrine written in abandoned concrete and wasted months. On the Bataan Peninsula, American engineers destroyed their own half-finished runway, rather than let it fall to advancing Japanese forces. 6 weeks of back-breaking labor under tropical sun, 200 tons of concrete hauled 8,000 miles from California, reduced to rubble by demolition charges because time ran faster than construction timelines. The pattern repeated itself like a curse across the Pacific. Wake Island surrendered, with its bomber strip existing only as blueprints and good intentions. Clark Field in the Philippines sat 70% complete and 100% useless when the final assault came. Concrete demanded perfection, stable supply lines, secure perimeters, uninterrupted schedules. War provided none of these luxuries, and concrete refused to compromise. Standing in his Manila headquarters before the final evacuation, Casey wrote words in his operational log that would prove more prophetic than he could know. Concrete runways are a peacetime luxury we cannot afford. The perfect has become the enemy of the good, and the good has become the enemy of the possible. He had no solution, only the growing certainty that American pilots would keep dying because engineers couldn't build runways fast enough to save them. 8,000 miles away in Pittsburgh, a metallurgist named Gerald Grolich was eating lunch when he found the answer Casey couldn't see. Carnegie Steel's cafeteria smelled like coffee and industrial grease, and Grolich sat reading Aviation Week while his sandwich went cold. The February issue showed photographs of abandoned airstrips in the Pacific. Half-poured concrete, rusted rebar, construction equipment left behind when the Japanese came too fast. Grolich studied those images the way other men studied art, seeing not failure, but possibility in the spaces between what was and what could be. He pulled out his notebook and began sketching rectangles with holes in them. His colleagues noticed first. Tom Morrison, a structural engineer who'd worked Pennsylvania Railroad bridges with Grolich for years, leaned over with curious amusement. "Jerry, what are you designing now? Another bridge support?" Grolich looked up from his calculations without stopping his pencil. Airplane runways made from perforated steel sheets that lock together. He showed Morrison the sketch. Rows of interlocking panels, each 10 feet by 2 feet, covered in precisely engineered holes distributed across their surface like a mathematical constellation. Morrison laughed so hard his coffee nearly came out his nose. "Jerry, airplanes need solid surfaces, not Swiss cheese. You can't land a 15-ton bomber on metal sheets full of holes." The entire cafeteria table erupted in laughter that Grolich barely heard. His slide rule was already clicking through calculations that would change warfare forever. That afternoon, alone in Carnegie Steel's metallurgy laboratory, he began proving that everything the aviation industry believed about runways was wrong. Holes didn't weaken steel structures if you engineered them correctly. They redirected stress loads more efficiently than solid sheets, distributing weight through patterns instead of concentrating force at impact points. Every bridge engineer understood this principle. Nobody had thought to apply it to runways. By evening, Grollich had filled 12 pages with mathematics that contradicted common sense and proved themselves irrefutable. His perforated steel planking could support aircraft weighing up to 20 tons while using 60% less material than solid sheets. Each panel would weigh just 66 pounds, light enough for 2 soldiers to carry, yet strong enough to handle repeated landings by America's heaviest bombers. The numbers didn't lie, even when they told uncomfortable truths. Grollich closed his notebook and stared out at Pittsburgh's skyline, where Carnegie Steel's blast furnaces painted the winter darkness orange. Somewhere in the Pacific, pilots were dying because they lacked forward airfields. The solution existed in his calculations, waiting for someone brave enough to trust mathematics over conventional wisdom. March 15, 1942. Grollich stood before a blackboard in Carnegie, Steel's main conference room, facing 12 senior engineers and 3 Army procurement officers who'd driven up from Washington expecting to waste an afternoon on another civilian's impractical idea. His prototype lay on the conference table, a single 10 by 2 foot panel weighing exactly 66 pounds. Its surface punctured by 384 precisely machined holes that defied everything these men had been taught about aircraft safety. Gentlemen, load distribution across perforated steel follows the same principles as I-beam structural design. Grollich began, his chalk moving across the blackboard with the confidence of someone who checked his math 100 times. These holes don't weaken the steel. They redirect stress loads more efficiently than solid plates. Major William Harrison studied the prototype with the skepticism of a man who'd spent 20 years overseeing concrete runway projects across the continental United States. Mr. Grollich, I appreciate Carnegie Steel's innovative spirit, but we're discussing aircraft operations, not bridge construction. Pilots need solid, stable surfaces. This looks like industrial grating. Harrison's tone carried authority earned through decades of successful projects, all of them built according to specifications that Grollich's proposal violated completely. Furthermore, perforated surfaces would collect debris, create drainage problems, and provide insufficient traction during wet weather operations. Grollich had anticipated every objection. He'd spent weeks refining his presentation, knowing that military procurement officers were trained to avoid risk, not embrace experimental solutions that contradicted established doctrine. May I demonstrate the load characteristics? Without waiting for permission, Grollich climbed onto the prototype panel and began jumping up and down. The steel flexed slightly, but showed no signs of structural distress. I weigh 170 pounds. This panel is supporting my full weight across 2 square feet of surface area, roughly equivalent to the pressure a B-25 bomber wheel exerts during landing. The demonstration failed to impress Harrison. Mr. Grollich, a B-25 weighs 15 tons and lands at 90 miles per hour. Your personal weight test hardly simulates combat landing conditions. He gathered his briefing papers, preparing to end a meeting that was wasting everyone's time. I'll include your proposal in our technical review process, but I suspect the Army Corps of Engineers will require extensive testing before considering any departure from established runway specifications. The meeting concluded with polite handshakes and non-committal promises that both sides knew meant no. Grollich watched the Army officers drive away, knowing his perforated steel planking would disappear into military bureaucracy unless someone with real authority recognized its potential. 2 weeks later, salvation arrived in the form of Captain John Thompson, recently transferred from the 805th Engineer Aviation Battalion to Wright-Patterson Field. Thompson possessed unique qualifications to evaluate Grollich's concept. He'd flown P-40 Warhawks throughout the Philippines campaign, landing on improvised surfaces that military engineers would have considered criminally inadequate. Coral beaches, jungle clearings, bomb-cratered concrete strips that bore little resemblance to peacetime runways. Thompson had survived them all, and that experience had taught him that aircraft could operate from surfaces far less perfect than military specifications demanded. When Grolich's technical specifications crossed Thompson's desk in early April, he spent 6 hours reading the mathematics with growing professional interest. On April 2nd, Thompson drove to Pittsburgh for a personal meeting. The two men spent the day in Carnegie Steel's testing facility, examining prototype panels and discussing practical requirements that had nothing to do with bureaucratic specifications and everything to do with keeping pilots alive under combat conditions. Thompson's questions focused on operational reality. How quickly could damaged panels be replaced? Could the system function with sections missing? Would the interlocking mechanism hold under repeated stress cycles? The breakthrough came when Thompson physically tested the prototype runway section himself. He bounced a 50-pound concrete block against the perforated surface, simulating the violent impact of aircraft landings under combat conditions. The steel flexed, absorbed the shock, then returned to its original shape without permanent deformation. "Mr. Grolich," Thompson said, running his hands across holes that felt more solid than half the surfaces he'd landed on in the Philippines, "I've touched down on worse in combat. This feels more reliable than improvised strips we used every day." Thompson's endorsement carried weight that procurement officers' skepticism couldn't overcome. He possessed credible combat experience, engineering training, and direct responsibility for airfield construction in the European theater. When Thompson submitted his technical evaluation to the War Department recommending immediate field trials, military aviation officials finally had an authoritative voice supporting the impossible runway concept. By May 15th, the Army authorized construction of a prototype runway at Wright-Patterson Field. Grolich's mathematical theory would finally face the ultimate test under actual aircraft operations. June 23, 1942. Captain Thompson stood at the edge of a runway that existed nowhere in military engineering manuals. 1,500 perforated steel panels stretched across Ohio grassland, each section locked to its neighbors through Grolich's interlocking hook system. The assembled surface looked like an enormous steel checkerboard, its thousands of precisely machined holes catching morning sunlight like a geometric prayer. Thompson checked his watch. 0830 hours. In 30 minutes, test pilot Lieutenant Robert Mitchell would attempt the first official landing on perforated steel planking, and the outcome would determine whether one civilian engineer's calculations could revolutionize military aviation, or prove that conventional wisdom existed for good reason. Colonel James Devine, chief runway engineer for the Army Corps, had arrived from Washington with decades of successful concrete projects on his record and deep reservations about landing heavy bombers on interlocking metal sheets full of holes. "Captain Thompson," Devine said, examining the perforated surface through field glasses, "I've investigated too many runway failures that resulted in aircraft casualties. If this system collapses under a 3,000-pound trainer, imagine the consequences with 15-ton bombers under combat conditions." Thompson understood Devine's concerns, but his combat experience provided different perspective. "Colonel, I've landed damaged fighters on surfaces that would horrify peacetime safety inspectors. The question isn't whether this meets peacetime standards. It's whether perforated steel provides better operational capability than concrete runways we can't build fast enough." At 0900 hours precisely, Lieutenant Mitchell's North American AT-6 Texan trainer appeared on final approach. The single-engine aircraft weighed 3,000 pounds and represented the lightest operational military plane in the Army inventory. If perforated steel couldn't support an AT-6, it certainly couldn't handle B-25 bombers and P-47 fighters that would define the system's ultimate utility. Mitchell maintained standard landing procedures, touching down at 65 miles per hour, The moment his wheels contacted Grolish's perforated surface, Thompson heard distinctive metallic ringing. Not the sharp crack of structural failure, but the resonant ping of steel flexing under load and returning to its original shape like a tuning fork struck once and held. "Surface feels solid as concrete," Mitchell reported over radio to the control tower. No unusual vibrations, no indication of structural movement. The perforations create interesting visual effects during rollout, but aircraft handling characteristics remain completely normal. Mitchell taxied to the runway's end, then executed a standard takeoff using the same perforated surface. Again, the system performed flawlessly with no sign of panel separation or surface deterioration. Devine remained cautious despite success. Captain Thompson, an AT-6 trainer, hardly represents operational loads we'll encounter in combat theaters. I need to see this system handle aircraft that actually matter for strategic operations. Thompson had anticipated this objection. His testing protocol reflected systematic engineering validation rather than reckless experimentation. The B-25 test occurred 2 days later, under perfect weather conditions. Mitchell's bomber approached the perforated runway at standard operational speed. Its twin Wright R2600 Cyclone engines throttled back for landing configuration. Thompson watched through binoculars as the 15-ton aircraft contacted Grolish's steel surface with significantly greater impact force than the trainer test. The perforated panels flexed visibly under the bomber's main landing gear, distributing concentrated wheel loads across multiple interlocking sections, exactly as Grolish's calculations had predicted. "Runway performance excellent," Mitchell reported after completing his landing roll. "Surface provides adequate traction, no structural movement detected. Aircraft handling normal throughout all phases of ground operations." The test pilot's professional assessment carried enormous weight with military evaluators, who relied on operational aircrew reports to judge new equipment under realistic conditions. Devine's resistance began wavering as test results accumulated. His engineering training told him Grolish's mathematical analysis was fundamentally sound, even though it contradicted established practices. More importantly, reports from the Pacific Theater continued emphasizing desperate need for rapid airfield construction capability. By July 15th, Wright-Patterson trials had validated perforated steel planking for aircraft weighing up to 20 tons. Test pilots reported consistently positive experiences across multiple aircraft types. The interlocking panel system showed no signs of structural fatigue despite repeated heavy operations, and installation proved remarkably efficient compared to concrete construction timelines. The breakthrough moment came when Devine submitted his official technical evaluation to the War Department. Perforated steel planking performs in accordance with manufacturer specifications and provides acceptable operational characteristics for military aircraft operations. Recommend immediate procurement for field trials in active combat theaters. The man who'd initially dismissed Grolish's system as impractical now championed its adoption based on objective engineering. Evidence Carnegie Steel received orders for 50,000 perforated panels by August 1st, with production specifications calling for 2,000 sections per day once manufacturing reached full capacity. Each panel required precise perforation, 384 holes machined to exact dimensional tolerances, followed by galvanizing treatment to prevent corrosion under tropical conditions. Grolish supervised production scaling personally, working 18-hour days to ensure manufacturing processes maintained the mathematical precision his design required. By September, Carnegie Steel's Pittsburgh facility was producing perforated steel planking at rates that could support major military operations worldwide. The impossible idea sketched on a lunch napkin was becoming the foundation of American air power projection across global combat theaters. October 8th, 1942. Casablanca, French Morocco. Captain Thompson stood knee-deep in Atlantic surf, watching Liberty ships discharge the first combat shipment of perforated steel planking onto North African beaches. Operation Torch had commenced 72 hours earlier, and American forces needed operational airfields immediately to support ground troops advancing inland against Vichy French resistance. Traditional concrete runway construction would require 6 weeks minimum, time that General Patton's armored columns couldn't afford, while German reinforcements arrived daily from Tunisia. Thompson's engineering battalion had practiced assembly procedures for 2 months at Fort Belvoir. But theory differed dramatically from reality when German Stukas were bombing supply convoys and French artillery was targeting beach landing zones. Each 10 by 2 foot panel weighed 66 pounds when dry, but Atlantic spray and Moroccan sand added another 10 pounds of dead weight that exhausted soldiers had to manhandle from ship to shore through heavy surf. The interlocking hooks that functioned perfectly in Ohio, testing laboratories now jammed with salt corrosion and gritty debris that required constant cleaning to maintain proper panel connections. "Sir, we've got 800 panels ashore and ready for assembly," Sergeant William Morrison reported, gesturing toward neat stacks of perforated steel arranged across the Casablanca beachhead. "We need 1,500 sections for a 3,000-foot operational runway capable of handling P-40 Warhawk operations. At current unloading rates, we'll have sufficient materials by 1,800 hours today." Thompson checked his tactical situation map, noting German reconnaissance flights circling American positions since dawn. Intelligence indicated Luftwaffe bombers based in Rabat were preparing strikes against Allied beachhead operations, which meant American air cover was critically necessary within 24 hours. "Sergeant Morrison, begin assembly immediately with available materials. We'll extend the runway as additional panels come ashore, but I need a minimum 1,500-foot strip operational by dawn tomorrow." The assembly process revealed both the system's revolutionary capabilities and its practical limitations under combat conditions. Grolich's interlocking design allowed rapid installation. 2 soldiers could position and connect each panel in approximately 3 minutes using basic hand tools. However, North African sand created unexpected challenges laboratory testing hadn't anticipated. Windblown particles infiltrated panel connections, requiring constant maintenance to prevent separation during aircraft operations. More critically, the desert environment caused thermal expansion that loosened interlocking hooks unless installation crews maintained precise spacing tolerances. By 1,800 hours, Thompson's battalion had assembled a 2,000-foot runway, despite intermittent Stuka attacks that interrupted construction multiple times. The perforated surface looked alien against the Moroccan landscape, a geometric steel carpet stretching across sand dunes and scrub vegetation. Local observers watched installation with fascination, having never seen aircraft operations conducted from anything other than packed earth or concrete surfaces. The operational test came at 0630 the following morning when Major Robert Johnson approached the strip in his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The 7-ton fighter represented significant load increase over previous testing, and Johnson's combat mission profile required maximum fuel and ammunition loads that pushed aircraft weight to operational limits. Thompson monitored the landing attempt through field glasses, knowing success or failure would determine whether technology could support actual combat operations, rather than merely peacetime testing procedures. Johnson's Thunderbolt contacted the perforated surface at 85 miles per hour with characteristic P-47 authority. The steel panels flexed visibly under the fighter's main landing gear, creating distinctive metallic sounds Thompson had learned to interpret during Ohio trials. No panel separation occurred, no structural failure developed. Runway surface acceptable for operational use, Johnson reported via radio. Aircraft handling characteristics normal, no unusual vibrations or control problems detected. The Casablanca strip became operational on October 10th, supporting 12 P-47 sorties against German positions near Rabat. Each landing and takeoff validated Grolich's mathematical predictions about load distribution and structural integrity. More importantly, rapid installation timeline had provided air cover for American ground forces exactly when needed. rather than 6 weeks later when concrete runways would have become available. Word of the North African success reached General Henry Arnold, commanding general of Army Air Forces, within 48 hours. Arnold's strategic vision for global air power projection depended entirely on rapid airfield construction capability, since American bombers and fighters could only operate from bases within range of strategic targets. The system promised to revolutionize this fundamental limitation by allowing airfield construction anywhere American forces could establish temporary control. From Pacific coral atolls to European farmland, Arnold authorized massive production increases with orders for 500,000 panels to support upcoming Mediterranean and Pacific operations. Carnegie Steel's Pittsburgh facility expanded to 24-hour production schedules, employing 3,000 workers dedicated exclusively to perforated steel planking manufacture. December 15th brought ultimate validation when Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific fleet began incorporating airfields into Operation Cartwheel. The systematic advance toward Japanese strongholds in the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal's Henderson Field received extensions that doubled operational capacity within 72 hours, transforming a marginal fighter base into a major bomber staging area. Installation required no concrete, no specialized construction equipment, and no extended curing periods that Japanese artillery could target during vulnerable construction phases. By year's end, 47 airfields were operational across 3 combat theaters from North Africa to the Southwest Pacific. Total runway length exceeded 150 miles of perforated steel surface, supporting everything from single-engine fighters to 4-engine heavy bombers. The mathematical precision Grollich had calculated on Carnegie Steel napkins was proving itself under the most demanding operational conditions imaginable. But the ultimate test still lay ahead. Intelligence reports from the Pacific indicated Japanese forces were developing new artillery tactics specifically designed to target American airfield construction. The static nature of concrete runways made them vulnerable to systematic bombardment that could render them inoperational for weeks. Modular design offered theoretical advantages for rapid repair, but those advantages had never been tested under concentrated enemy fire. The Anzio beachhead would provide that test under conditions where failure meant not just engineering disappointment, but potential military disaster for thousands of Allied soldiers, depending on air support for survival. January 22nd, 1944. Anzio beachhead, Italy. Captain Thompson crouched in a muddy crater 50 yards from the strip that had become the lifeline for 36,000 Allied soldiers, trapped on a narrow coastal plain. German 88mm artillery shells had been falling steadily for 18 hours, part of systematic bombardment designed to destroy the perforated steel runway that allowed American P-47 Thunderbolts to provide close air support for the besieged beachhead. At 03:15 hours, a direct hit had obliterated a 200-foot section of the runway's center, leaving a jagged gap that conventional wisdom declared impossible to repair under combat conditions. Thompson studied damage through field glasses as another artillery barrage erupted. Across the airfield perimeter, 27 panels lay twisted and shattered, their interlocking hooks severed by concussion waves that had created a crater 15 feet deep and 30 feet across. Standard runway repair doctrine called for heavy construction equipment, concrete patches, and minimum 48-hour curing periods, resources that simply didn't exist on a contested beachhead where German forces controlled surrounding high ground and could observe every Allied movement. "Sir, we've got P-47s inbound at 0600 with close support missions for the British 1st Division," Sergeant Morrison reported, his voice barely audible over continuing artillery fire. Without air cover, General Lucas expects German counterattacks to overrun our forward positions by nightfall. Thompson had trained his engineering crews for exactly this scenario during installation exercises at Fort Belvoir. But theory differed dramatically from reality when Nebelwerfer rocket salvos were targeting repair operations, and Messerschmitt fighters were strafing supply convoys attempting to deliver replacement panels. The modular nature of Grolich's design theoretically allowed rapid section replacement, but only if engineering crews could work without constant interruption from enemy fire. Sergeant Morrison organized 12-man repair teams with replacement panels staged at the crater perimeter. German artillery observers can see our airfield clearly from Monte Battaglia, so we'll conduct repair operations during brief intervals between bombardment cycles. Thompson's approach reflected hard-learned lessons about working under direct observation. Successful repair required precise timing, coordinated with German firing patterns rather than continuous construction efforts. At 0400 hours, Thompson's first repair team sprinted across exposed runway surface, carrying replacement panels toward the bomb crater. German artillery had maintained regular firing schedules throughout the night with approximately 12-minute intervals between major bombardment cycles. This narrow window provided barely enough time to position and connect 4 panels before the next salvo forced crews to abandon the repair site and seek protective cover. The interlocking hook system that had functioned flawlessly during peacetime testing now proved its combat value under the most extreme operational conditions. Each panel weighed 66 pounds, light enough for 2 soldiers to manhandle quickly across broken terrain, yet strong enough to support repeated aircraft landings once properly connected to adjacent sections. More critically, damaged panels could be disconnected and replaced individually without affecting surrounding runway sections, a capability concrete runways could never provide. Thompson's crews worked with mechanical precision despite chaos surrounding them. As German shells impacted 50 yards away, sending shrapnel whistling overhead, soldiers methodically positioned replacement panels into the crater gap, aligned interlocking hooks, and secured connections using standard field tools. By 0530 hours, repair teams had installed 18 replacement panels, reducing the runway gap from 200 feet to approximately 60 feet. Thompson calculated that P-47 operations could resume with this reduced opening, since Thunderbolt pilots could easily clear a 60-foot gap during takeoff and landing procedures. However, complete runway restoration required 9 additional panels to restore full operational capability for heavier aircraft, like B-25 Mitchell bombers. The critical moment came at 0545 when German artillery observers detected ongoing repair activity and redirected fire directly onto the runway. Thompson watched helplessly as 88-meter shells exploded across the partially repaired surface, sending steel fragments and concrete debris in all directions. Conventional runway materials would have been destroyed completely by this concentrated bombardment, requiring weeks of reconstruction, using heavy equipment that didn't exist on the Anzio beachhead. Instead, Grolich's modular design absorbed punishment with remarkable resilience. Individual panels that received direct hits were destroyed completely, but surrounding sections remained undamaged and fully functional. The interlocking system distributed shock loads across multiple panels, preventing cascade failures that would have rendered entire runway sections unusable. More importantly, damaged panels could be disconnected immediately and replaced with spare sections Thompson's supply teams had pre-positioned around the airfield perimeter. At 0600 hours precisely, Lieutenant Johnson's P-47 Thunderbolt appeared on final approach, despite continuing German artillery fire. Johnson had been briefed about incomplete runway repairs, but his close support mission was critically necessary for Allied ground forces facing renewed German attacks across the beachhead perimeter. Thompson held his breath as the 7-ton fighter contacted the patched surface at standard landing speed. Runway surface acceptable, Johnson reported via radio after completing a perfect landing. Panel connection solid, no unusual vibrations detected during rollout. Within 15 minutes, Johnson had refueled, rearmed, and taken off again, using the same repaired runway section, demonstrating that the system could provide continuous combat operations even under direct enemy fire. The Anzio, Validation established perforated steel planking as indispensable, component of Allied air power projection. By February 1st, Thompson's engineering battalion had repaired the runway 7 times following German bombardments, each time restoring full operational capability within 4 hours, using replacement panels delivered by LST landing ships. The cumulative damage would have rendered any concrete runway permanently unusable, but Grolich's modular design allowed indefinite repair cycles limited only by spare panel availability. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army headquarters received detailed reports about performance under combat, conditions with particular emphasis on rapid repair capabilities that maintained air support during critical ground. Operations word of Anzio success reached highest levels of Allied command within days. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander for Operation Overlord, studied specifications with intense interest as his staff planned airfield requirements for the upcoming Normandy invasion. Eisenhower's strategic vision required immediate air support for amphibious operations, which meant operational runways within 24 hours of initial landings rather than weeks needed for concrete construction. The mathematical precision Gerald Grolich had calculated in a Pittsburgh cafeteria was proving decisive not just in engineering terms, but in strategic military outcomes affecting the entire course of the war. Long after the smoke cleared and the last panel was laid, historians would calculate that perforated steel planking supported over 300,000 combat sorties across every theater of World War II. But numbers never capture what it meant. In that moment when engineers opened crates on a Moroccan beach and began assembling runways faster than the enemy could destroy them, or when repair crews sprinted across Italian craters under artillery fire, knowing that pilots overhead depended on holes in steel sheets to bring them home. One civilian metallurgist had trusted mathematics over conventional wisdom, and in doing so had given wings to a generation that would never know his name. The runways are gone now, reclaimed by jungle and desert and time, but the lesson remains, etched in the memory of every innovation that changed warfare, by refusing to accept that impossible was anything more than a calculation nobody had bothered to solve.